Professor Hong, you want me to talk, do you? Can you hear me? Everyone hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
It's good. Okay. Well, I'm back in California. Last time I spoke to you, I was on the other side of the United States. So now I'm back in your world. That is the Pacific Basin, which we all share. And I hope you remember from my previous remarks, those who were with me, that I regard us in the academic world, in the educational world, as a single community. And I'm going to talk about community today. I think we already have that feature, but not all of our societies have that feature. At any rate, it is an enormous pleasure to really be with you again. Your questions last time were so sharp and striking that I really learned from them. And I know that you will do the same this time. I'm not going to read the paper because I don't do that. I'm going to speak to the paper, which I know has been translated. So I chose an old-fashioned phrase, civic virtue. It's not used that much anymore, but I wanted to relate to a longer history. So I chose a word that goes back several thousand years in the Western tradition. It's a word that from the Latin, and the word civic was also related to words like civilization, civil, civility, and cities. Cities were important for the ancient Greeks, thought that it was within cities that we lived our fullest and best life. So that word was terribly, terribly important to them. Nowadays, we live in all kinds of communities, not just cities. So the word has had to move forward historically to different kinds of setting. So civic virtue, meaning the responsibilities of citizenship. We have duties to our societies. Our society has duties to us. I mentioned that subject at greater length in the paper. I could have chosen, Professor Hong, I could have chosen another title. And this would connect to your Blue Waves series and everything that you have been doing so wonderfully. The other title would have been Practical Liberal Education. Practical Liberal Education. So I'm going to talk about liberal education again, because that is what the Blue Wave series has been largely about, but in a different way and from a different perspective. And that is from the connection between liberal education and citizenship and civic virtue. Now, there's another word, this one from the Latin as well, and that is civic. The citizen, the person who lived in a particular society, was assumed to live in a republic. And America calls itself a republic. South Korea calls itself a republic. Britain is not a republic because it has a monarchy, but of course it's a symbolic monarchy. It's a constitutional monarch. So a republic was technically a nation that did not have a hereditary monarch, right? Did not have a king, did not have an emperor. But nevertheless, those countries which do have symbolic leaders and so on are essentially, from this perspective, really republics. And it was expected that within a republic, all certain categories of person, and historically not everybody, certain categories of person would have special responsibilities to that society to see that it functioned well, all right? And usually took an active part in the political realm. Well, it was also assumed by the ancient Greeks that the political realm was a city-state, a city-state. Well, I think Singapore would be a good example, right? A city-state, about that size, manageable, where you could think of a class of persons who could have a direct impact on that society. Most of us do not live in city states. We live in these larger nation states, and therefore, historically, one issue has been how to make citizens who function within a smaller unit, how to enable them to function in a large nation state. And since we can't all directly participate in the central government of our states, although we can participate locally, but since we can't participate in the central part of the state, we have representatives. So republic has come to also mean representative government, people whom we select as citizens to make decisions for us, but subject to our approval through complicated electoral processes that vary from society to society, right? We choose the people through a variety of means who are going to represent us, and then we withdraw our support when we no longer feel that they represent us. All right, I needn't go into all of that. I just want to set the setting for citizenship. Now, I always have to apologize to you because I'm really talking about Western culture, Western society, and today I'm going to be talking particularly about America, which is undergoing an acute moment in the history of civic virtue. I think you follow what's going on in the United States. The country is deeply divided politically, angrily. It's almost tribal in some respects, very strange. And the search for some kind of shared culture is being talked about in higher education circles. So it is a Western problem, but you have different perspectives from the histories of your own societies. And every society has to have a government. Every society has to decide how leaders will be chosen. Every society has to work these issues out about how you participate as an individual or don't. So you will have a comparative perspective to offer me. I'll throw out the categories, I'll put out the language, I'll use the term, I'll give examples, but then you can come right in using the comparative method, which I think is really necessary in scholarship, particularly for historians. We talk about the comparative method, how to compare and contrast how societies really work. Okay, so citizenship, Republican behavior, and practical liberal education. Because the idea is that if you are to participate actively in decision-making in your own society, you have to be educated for that role. What kind of education should you have? We've been talking about this. And I'm suggesting to you that the education historically that is connected to citizenship is in fact liberal education. Liberal education in two senses, okay? One, to participate fully, we have to have a good sense of who we are. We have to know something about the culture of our society, right? But we are not being prepared for a particular occupation. Citizenship is not an occupation. It's not like medicine. It's not like law, right? It's not like engineering. It is, again, this old problem of what do we do with our liberal education? Well, we exercise our citizenship. We have to be that rounded person, knowledgeable person who understands human behavior within the context of a republic. So it's terribly important. And the other aspect of liberal education, and I spoke about this before, was not that we do this just for ourselves. We do it for others as well. We bring our knowledge, our understanding of how society works for the assistance to others in that society, and specifically today as citizens, okay? So liberal education may not be vocational. That's the problem we encounter in all our societies. You're telling your children what should they do in life, you know, prepare for vocationally or professionally. But yet we want to argue that there is another element, and that is liberal education, so that you can live to the fullest in your society and you can contribute to your society. Right? There is a selfish theory of liberal education. I think I wrote about that, Professor Hall, in a previous paper. And then there is an altruistic contribution, right? Where you don't think about yourself all the time, but you think about what you can do or how you can help other people, right? Okay, so citizenship, civic virtue, and practical liberal education. The person whose education has been rounded in some way to have some knowledge of human behavior, how societies work, how decisions are made, what are the moral codes of society, what are the legal institutions of society, what are the family structures of society, some knowledge, not expert knowledge, some understanding that these are important ways of knowing who we are and helping our society. Liberal education. Now, practical education, civic virtue is going to be applying that education directly to society. And I have some ideas that I would like to share with you about how that is done. Now, let me talk about why this has been such an important subject, particularly in today's America, all right? It really is a crucial subject today in America today. And that is because Americans are undergoing a kind of moral and political crisis at the moment. I'm going to speak very frankly and honestly because I'm a scholar, and scholars have to tell what they feel to be the truth on the basis of evidence that they know. But we are not united today. We don't have a shared culture, okay? An easily definable shared culture. We don't have a single religious culture, right? We're not, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We don't have a lot of other family values that are shared, right? We may have a popular entertainment culture, but I'm not in favor of that. That doesn't appeal to me, all right? We developed without a homogeneous culture because of the whole nature in which North America was settled. Right? And let's just say there were three broad groups that came to this country, even more heterogeneous than that. But the first was the population that was living here, the Native Americans who were here and had been here for centuries. Those peoples were here when the Europeans first arrived. And then there was the. Sorry, am I hear a sound.
Please mute your microphone, please. Please mute your microphone, please.
Mute my microphone?
No. Not 토니스 선생님 저기 중국 분한테 저 마이크로폰 좀 꺼달라고 제가 지금 누가 얘기하고 찾을 수가 없어서.
这句话超棒的，你看啊，快乐的世界需要很多，努力的工作是为了快乐的生活，这句话就很表达，这个就是有意义的一句话。像刚刚你选的，虽然是一句话，但是它没有很明确的意义。他说努力的工作，为什么要工作？就是因为要快乐的生活，这句话是很有意义。好，我们就抄这句。我们今天把它完成，好不好？大家要懂一句话的意思了吗
Okay. Yes.
It looks so. I'm very sorry. Please continue.
No. It's wonderful. I love it. It's great. So there was the indigenous population that was here, that had been here for thousands of years. Then there was the imported slave population, a real major problem for America, an ongoing pathology, one that we've had to deal with to correct a population that was enslaved in this country. And we are still working on that one. There have been improvements, but we're still working on that one. And then the third were the immigrants who came from all over the world, speaking all different kinds of languages, right, from all different kinds of backgrounds. And out of all of these people, we were going to make Americans. And I think we have, but not purely, and right now with some difficulty, but we're working on it. And I hope that some inherent strength will come forward to realize that this was a good way of behaving, to take all the peoples who wanted to come and make them into one sort of family. But we have to find a way of sharing the culture. As I said, we're too diverse to have a single religion. There were some European and other countries that had a state religion, right? We have many religions, all kinds of religions, and creating them anew all of the time. We didn't have that kind of shared. We didn't have a shared culture, some literary culture that could be shared, that maybe for a while, but it doesn't exist today. So I'm suggesting, and others have been suggesting, that the shared culture, the one that makes America America, would be civic virtue, the idea of the contribution of an educated person to society. I should say as a footnote, in the 18th century, at the time that the American Constitution was being framed, there was even a question about which language should be the national language. It wasn't necessarily clear that it would be English, because we had a lot of other languages spoken in the country, right? There was Dutch, there was Swedish, there was French, there were many other languages. So it wasn't quite clear that it necessarily would be English, but of course, the colonies were under Britain, and so I suppose it is inevitable that English would become the national language. I only want to point out the enormous diversity, heterogeneity, differences that existed in the country as it set about to find a common basis for sharing our lives, okay? And that common basis had to come through civic virtue, right? And we had to educate people for civic virtue. And this is what many of the early framers of the Constitution thought, like Thomas Jefferson, that we really, a democracy, we were going to become, not all republics are democracies, but we were going to be a republic and a democracy. Right? There had to be education for that task. And Jefferson himself established the University of Virginia. He was the founder of the University of Virginia, dedicated to the creation of a democratic society through civic participation, okay? Okay, so there's been a long-standing search throughout American history to find a common shared culture, to make one people out of all of the people who have existed and who live here, okay? There are many different kinds of people, which at its best is just wonderful. It is simply wonderful to be with people from all over the world together, but we must find a common way of sharing some of the values. If you're going to have a cohesive society, which is capable of making sensible decisions about how to function and how to live together in a good society, in a happy society, where people think about one another. I'm very strong on this feeling as I've gotten older, that thinking about somebody else, making somebody else comfortable, is really a high moral value in society. And thinking about oneself a little bit less, not thinking that you're always so important, is probably a healthy way to live, okay? We have had an individualist culture in America, inherited from the 18th century European Enlightenment and the American Enlightenment, which focused on the individual. It was sometimes called the selfish philosophy. Okay? There are thinkers who feel that has simply gone too far, that thinking about oneself all the time is not really healthy for living in a society. One has to think about somebody else. And let me take two elements of that, two strains of that, and talk about citizenship in two dimensions. One is the role of the state, the role of the central authority, the governing authority of the state. And the second is, again, the individual by himself or herself and in connection with others. So let's talk just a little bit about the role of the state, because there is a major argument today in American society, probably in other societies, depending on how much authority should be given to the state, how much power should the central government or any government have, and how much authority should reside within the individual. Obviously, if the individual does not have some scope for the personal behavior, there can be no civic virtue. There'd be no reason to participate in society if all the decisions were made by central government. Right? So this is a long-standing story in Western civilization, the role of a powerful government versus the role of the liberty or freedom of the individual. And in America, this was supposed to be resolved within the American Constitution, which laid out the rights and duties and responsibilities of government towards individuals, okay? But it's opened up again. It always opens up because as we go through history, more and more problems occur, which require more and more decisions, some of which are brand new, some of which some people say can only be solved by state action, and others who say, no, you have to have individuals still functioning as individuals in their society. That latter part has given rise to a very strong private culture in America. I think you all know about it. It's led to the creation, for example, of private universities, universities that are not created by the state and not funded by the state. Museums and art galleries, public art galleries, depend heavily upon individuals contributing through philanthropy, right? But there are all sorts of activities, societies that handle the problems of the homeless, private hospitals that have been established, all of which are elements of civic virtue, that is the individuals operating on their own, connecting to others, but without government and without government tax money. And that's another issue, because if the government taxes very heavily, that leaves less resources in the hands of individuals. Therefore, they can't exercise civic virtue in that way by contributing to the institutions that they love or want, right? So it's a trade-off. What should government do? What should individuals do? And the two political parties in the United States, two major political parties, disagree on how that should be done. Let me just say from just a clearer perspective, not to get involved in a deep argument at the moment, both sides have a case. Both sides are right. There are roles for government that individuals cannot assume, and there are roles for the individual that it would be better for individuals to assume. One doesn't always, in this country, want the government to intrude upon private life, and yet when problems are not really adequately addressed, transportation problems, health problems, it may be necessary for the state to intervene. So it's a constant trade-off. You understand? It's a back and forth. It's a fight. It happens continually, and it will always happen, given the nature of this society. The problem is, or the answer is, to find some kind of balance where individuals can participate freely and the state will enter into those arenas where the state really has to be, because individuals together cannot solve those issues. I could go backward in time to tell the story in a different way about attempts to curtail the power of the king. Let me just mention one episode, and it's not frequently, does not appear in the historical literature as much as it should be, but the first of the ancient societies, I suppose Western society, would be ancient Israel, which did curtail the power of the king. Okay, it did that by not allowing the king to be also a temporal and a religious power, which was very unusual in the ancient world of the Middle East, let's say Egypt, where the kings are all gods, right? And in other societies where kingship and godship were combined. When you do that, you put the moral, religious, and political authority together in one source, there is no freedom for anybody. The Roman society went through two phases. There was the Republic, from which we get civic virtue, but then there was the Roman Empire, and in the Roman Empire, the Roman emperors were both, again, gods and kings. So they combined that. So one has to remember that this strain to limit the power of the state keeps going on in Western society. There's another attempt in the 18th century to combine in some source kingly and priestly authority, but that doesn't last very long. So you have to separate. In order to weaken the state, you have to take away from it its religious authority, and that has been largely successful in the Western world. Largely successful in the Western world. Okay, now.
편집이요? 아니면 저기요?
There is another phrase that's used rather than civic virtue. It's more common today, and it's called civil society. Civil society, okay? And that, again, refers to the same thing I'm talking to, that part of society which is not influenced or is under the authority of government. So civil society consists of the citizens of a society who gather together to achieve some sort of end. They create a foundation or a company, to create a museum, or to create a college, right? To provide a new kind of museum. As I said before, to help the homeless. There are societies to help the homeless. Societies for civic improvement, people who get together, contribute in order to improve the way the city looks without the use of government. So civil society is that arena of human affairs where government is not directly involved. There can be cooperation, however. Government could give money to various societies, but not tell the societies exactly how to use that money. You can get this kind of cooperation. Civil society in America is first really spoken about in a philosophical and in an historical way of some depth in the 1830s by the French visitor to America, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote one of the greatest books, maybe the greatest book in political science about America that's ever been written. A young Frenchman came here in the 1830s to see how this new society would function, and he noted how Americans didn't wait for government, but got together to get things done through voluntary communities, right? Through voluntary communities. Today, there is, right now, quite a lot of talk about civil society, but there's also talk about how you create a shared culture. And that is really important. It's really very important, and I'm really quite surprised to see how much energy and talk is going into that subject, but not necessarily from government, mainly from academic organizations or universities or professional associations, which are talking more and more about how through education we can get back to civic virtue and how we can create a shared culture. And the kinds of solutions that are emerging are very, very interesting. Let me go back a little bit and say something rather unusual, perhaps. And that is, in the ancient worlds of Greece, in a city-state world, one of the major obligations of the citizen was to be a soldier. That is, the army was, in fact, a place for the exercise of civic virtue. These are not professional armies. These are citizen armies. Okay? These are people who serve for a limited period of time, who don't make a career out of the army, and then they go back to civic life. And the idea there is that you don't have an investment in being a warrior. You have an investment in helping your society for only a short period of time. But because you are not a professional military person, you always have a more objective view about the use of force in society. Now, some societies today do have mandatory military service in the West, where you serve for a few years, you give up a few years of your life for the defense of your country. Israel, I think it's for women and for men, it's become universal. Sweden, I think, has such a law, but I'm not sure that everybody does it. And we did, when I was young, at certain, if you went to certain universities, you had to take military training for a few years. And then that stopped after the conflicts, particularly Vietnam. And now it's there voluntarily, but we no longer require compulsory military service. But there are some, and I might be one of them, who thinks that it would not be a bad idea for a young person after finishing secondary school to go into the military as an obligation to society. But there's a broader view of this now, and that is, no, not just the military, that's a choice, but we should also encourage young people to go into all kinds of activities in society and get practical knowledge of how society works, then go back to university and maybe back and forth. That's why I call civic virtue practical virtue. You learn, you get liberally educated by helping your communities. For example, you could go to a nonprofit association that provides daycare for families that can't afford it, right? Or we have a program called Teaching for America, where young people teach populations that are not privileged and devote their time. There are so many things you could do to help society charitably. You could go be an intern in newspaper offices and learn how the press covers activities in society, right? I think there's no end to the numbers of different kinds of activities we could ask young people to participate in, and we would pay them, because unless they're paid, it's going to be rather difficult. So, and also paying somebody indicates that society thinks of them as having a certain value, a certain worth. So I would pay young people, and I would say that when you graduate high school, you would go maybe for a year and a half or 2 years, you would serve your society in some capacity with a lot of choices as how you want to do that. You could work in conservation corps, you could work in environmental systems, you could protect animals, you see, all of the activities. You could work in a hospital, you would help in a hospital, learn what that's all about. Can you imagine what a fantastic learning experience that would be? And then you come to university older, like the Israelis are, they're a few years older, and more mature, and more appreciative of what you might learn. And then let's say you've been in some you've performed some sort of civic duty. You've worked in a hospital, you come back to university, you say, I'd like to learn something more about human beings as patients, something more about how we organize medicine, the sociology of the professions. You can think of how you could go into a humanities and a general education from questions that have arisen by your participation in the outer world. I need to know more about this. And you learn something about it from a formal educational point of view. Then there may be even a possibility for you to go back into the world of civic virtue, but I'm not talking about that yet. I'm really thinking about what happens to a young person after graduation from high school and before entering university. So I'm in favor, personally, in some form of compulsory activity of that kind. I'm not the only one. I've mentioned in the written version of this talk that the National Academies Arts and one of the major national academies has come out with a similar report about civic virtue, that many of the other academic associations are talking in this language, that some universities are now requiring undergraduates to take more courses in politics because they don't know how the society works. Okay, how are decisions made politically? So there may be mandatory courses before you graduate in the functioning of your society, because young people have no idea really today how leaders are chosen, what the responsibilities of leadership are, what are the constraints on leadership, what are the goals of leadership. They don't understand this. They don't know it. They don't know anything about taxing systems. All right. So some of the universities in the United States are starting to think about requiring undergraduates to take courses along those lines. So we have this double movement. One is civic virtue required of all members of society, that is all members of society, women as well as men, no distinctions made. Okay? Women perform the same tasks as men, including military service if they so choose. But we're giving choices. You don't have to do it that way. You do it another way. Okay? But women as well as men, because that's democratic. And because women are as educated today as men, and as I think some of you know, in many educational systems, women now are more numerous than are men. I think there are more women undergraduates probably in American universities today than there are men. I think in some medical schools, women are the majority. Some of the law schools, at least the same. It's a different world. It's the 21st century. We want women to participate absolutely, fully in the way they are so capable of doing, and it's been proven over and over again. So I'm talking about everybody. If there are exemptions, it would have to be made for physical reasons or medical reasons or some personal hardship, something of that sort. You have to have some flexibility, but still, civic virtue, a requirement for everybody. Now, that, I think, is a way to try to achieve the shared culture that Americans have striven for so long. If everyone, every young person knows that he or she has an obligation to other people in society and must go out and work in that real world, as we call it, the real world, then they learn about people. They learn about the difficulties of life. They learn about the problems that individuals have. They learn about suffering. They learn about compassion. They learn about decency. They become moral human beings. And that is an essential element of being liberally educated. And they work for a good society, a conception of a good society. And a good society, to me, is one that thinks about how it may make as many people as possible comfortable, happy, and taken care of, or at least comfortable and taken care of. So that is a very shorthand version, Dr. Hong, of the issue of civic virtue. It is practical liberal education. It is a different way to think about how our societies function and what kind of education is best for those societies. And it is a way of achieving for America that historic goal of a liberal education, which has been so much talked about because so many people think we don't have it anymore, but we do have it. We just have to put it into a different way, of a different form. So that, I think, are my prepared remarks for the oral presentation. I think you may want a break, I don't know, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm still here.